In the 1980s, it became possible for doctors to diagnose various genetic and chromosomal disorders in very early embryos produced in vitro. The procedure most widely spread is known as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, sometimes PID. In this procedure, a single cell is removed from an 8-cell embryo and analyzed genetically. Removal of this cell does not affect the development of the embryo. More recently, another technique, karyomapping, has been under development, and it is hoped that it will make the process even more effective. PGD and karyomapping allow a couple who know their embryos to be at risk to undergo IVF to produce several embryos. These embryos are then tested and 1 or 2 healthy embryos selected for implantation. Other healthy embryos, if any, can be frozen for later use or donated to others. Embryos with diseases and disabilities are discarded. By such means, parents can avoid the trauma of having a child with a disease or disability without having to have an abortion. In this short lecture, we'll be looking at several moral arguments concerning the selection for and selection against that can be achieved via PGD and similar techniques. Some people have objected to PGD and other genetic tests for fear of a slippery slope. We might start by discarding embryos with untreatable diseases, but end by eliminating many other embryos because of unjustifiable prejudices. We can respond to this by pointing out that the use of PGD depends on IVF. If you remember, IVF is very risky, unpleasant, and costly. So it seems implausible to expect that people will use it to eliminate trivial conditions or even non-trivial conditions whose effects are far in the future or manageable in some other way. If PGD is likely only to be used to identify and discard embryos with seriously disabling conditions, how could there be any moral objection to it? To find out what might be morally problematic about PGD and embryo selection, let us compare it with genetic engineering. So, in genetic engineering, one can change a child who would have had a disease or disability into a child without that disease or disability. While through PGD and embryo selection, one discards an embryo who would have developed into a child with a disease or disability. Put it differently, in the case of genetic engineering, there is a given embryo who, without the intervention, would develop into a person with some disease or disability, and who, with the intervention, will develop into a person who does not have any disease or disability. In the case of PGD and embryo selection, there is a given embryo who, without the intervention, would develop into a person with some disease or disability, and who, with the intervention, will die. So by using PGD to select against embryos with the genetic makeup that would lead to certain diseases, we are not eliminating diseases. We are eliminating embryos with diseases. This points to what for many is an important moral difference. Anyone who believes that early embryos have the right to live will believe that PGD is morally problematic. If you believe the right to live emerges only at the 14th day or at some later stage in development, you will reject the idea that embryos destroyed at the 8-cell stage of development have the right to live. Could someone who denies that the early embryo has the right to live still find PGD and embryo selection morally problematic? Yes, they can. For instance, one might think that discarding embryos because they have diseases or disabilities is morally unacceptable because someone's being disabled or having a disease does not justify killing them. Can we respond to this in turn? We might try to justify the use of PGD by claiming that we are doing it for the sake of those we kill. It might seem obvious that anyone who could choose to live without a disease or disability would choose that over living with the disease or disability. However, this isn't a choice in PGD. The choice is between living with a disease or disability and not living at all. We might persist. We might think that if it were us, we would choose not to live rather than to live with a given disease or disability. If you ask those without a given disease or disability what life would be like with that disease or disability, people would typically say that that life would not be worth living. Those lucky enough to be healthy often fail to imagine how could it be possible to live satisfactory, full lives were they less lucky. We can find a problem with this line of response, because according to the testimony of those with certain diseases and disabilities, their lives are far from valueless. The idea that they would choose never to have lived rather than to live the life they do live, which is the only life they could live, is ruled out by such testimony. It's true, there are diseases and disabilities that are incompatible with a worthwhile life. For example, the Tay-Sachs disease leads to certain death by the age of 4 after the child has become progressively paralyzed, deaf, and blind. Or anencephaly is a similar condition which means that the child is born without a functioning cerebellum. But the existence of these diseases does not detract from the fact that the vast majority of genetic conditions are entirely consistent with a life that, seen from the point of view of the one who will live it, is entirely worthwhile. Once this is accepted, it might not seem so straightforwardly morally acceptable to discard or abort embryos with diseases and disabilities. At the very least, the claim that in discarding them we are attempting to alleviate their suffering will not stand up to closer scrutiny. At this stage, we might try another way of responding. Even if we cannot reasonably claim that in using PGD to select against embryos with diseases and disabilities, we are trying to save them from suffering, perhaps we could claim that we are attempting to alleviate our own suffering. When parents discard an embryo with a disease or a disability, they might do so because they think their marriage might not stand the strain of caring for such a child, or that they will focus on this child to the detriment of their other children, or they might believe they would not be able to be decent parents to such a child, or even they might simply believe that their own lives would not be worth living if they had to care for such a child. It is possible to imagine any number of motivations of this sort, all of them compatible with the belief that the embryo, allowed to live, would have a worthwhile life. In many societies, the lives of people who care for those with debilitating diseases or disabilities can be almost intolerable. Carers complain of having no social life, of having to give up work, of finding themselves penniless, and of having to deal with endlessly frustrating, petty administrative duties. Some carers argue that being a carer can be almost as disabling as suffering from the disease itself. Moreover, it wouldn't only be the parents who would have to care for the child. Eventually, even if only when the parents died, the state would become involved. Money that could be spent on other things would have to be spent on catering for the person who would not have been born had PGD been used to select against them at birth. So, there seems to be a sense in which all of us will suffer if we allow that person to be born, if only because they will use more resources than a healthy person. What's the problem with this line of reasoning? In response, some people have suggested that there is something wrong with a society in which caring for someone with a disease or disability is so distressing that it is better for us to deprive those with disease and disabilities of the only life they'd be able to have. This implies that there might be something wrong with our values if the only way we can think of to deal with the distress of caring is to eliminate those who need care. After all, we are never going to be able successfully to eliminate the need to care for others. Not so long as people are helpless when young, and often also when old, and so long as people have accidents. The suggested solution is to do something to make caring less distressing. The proposal is that the only truly moral thing to do would be to rearrange things so that carers can live worthwhile lives consistently with caring for loved ones. Were we successfully to improve the lot of carers, parents would have less incentives to undergo the discomforts of IVF and PGD to select against embryos that might need extra care. We would also, perhaps, eliminate some of the fear we have of becoming old and helpless, knowing that in doing so, we will almost certainly become a burden on those we love. There is another side of the process of PGD and embryo selection, and that is covered by the moral problem triggered by the selection for certain characteristics. Many parents would want a child who resembles them in some way, especially perhaps in the ways that they consider to be an important part of their identity. Also, what might be seen as a disability by some is just a difference for others. Some parents might want to use PGD to select for babies with certain disabilities. For example, deaf parents might believe that deafness is a difference and not a disability and want to select for, not against, a child who is deaf. Is this morally problematic? Another case of selection for is that of savior siblings. IVF and PGD can be used to identify and select for embryos who are immunologically compatible with another person and therefore able to provide stem cells to treat that person. So-called savior siblings are children who are born as the result of IVF and PGD to save the life of a sibling. Consider the case of Jamie Whittaker, which was born in 2003 so that he could save the life of Charlie, his older brother. Charlie has diamond blackfan anemia, a rare genetic condition treatable only by a stem cell transplant from a matching donor. The boy's parents, Michelle and Jason Whittaker, selected the embryo that became Jamie after IVF undertaken solely in the hope of producing a genetic match for Charlie. The Whittakers had to travel to the US for treatment because the Human Embryo and Fertilization Authority in the UK refused to grant the family application because there would be no direct benefit to the unborn child. The argument against this use of PGD is thus based on the idea that the savior sibling is being used as a means to others' ends. Note, this is not necessarily incompatible with the ontology, as one can be both an end in itself and a means to others' ends. The problem in this case is rather that one cannot ask for someone's consent to be someone else's savior sibling. In response, one might say that no one would prefer not to have been born than to have been born in order to be used as a means to someone else's end. But is this claim generally true? The answer depends on the way in which and the extent to which a child will be used as a means to the ends of others. If a savior sibling, once it has served its purpose, is neglected and abused, or if something prevents it from serving its purpose and it is rejected, then this is morally unacceptable because the child clearly was being used only as a means to the ends of others. Another morally problematic case of selection for is that of selecting for sex. Many embryos are selected against because they are female, and because in some cultures being female is considered intrinsically less valuable than being male. But not all sex selection is based on such a belief. Some parents wish to select for a sex for the purposes of balancing a family, or in order to avoid a sex-linked condition such as hemophilia. There are at least two difficulties with permitting parents to select for embryos for the purposes of family balancing. One, it is hard to distinguish those who have genuine reasons for wishing to select for a sex from those who believe one sex is intrinsically preferable. Also, it is socially valuable for there to be roughly equal numbers of males and females, and nature seems to be pretty good at ensuring this. The second reason seems to be rather good for refusing to interfere with nature, especially in the light of the first issue. And it's precisely this justification that is used by many countries to ban the use of PGD and other methods such as sperm selection in choosing a baby's sex. But these limitations can be overcome, as people will travel abroad to countries where they are permitted to choose their sex of their baby. So there is an important difference between eliminating diseases by genetic engineering and eliminating embryos with diseases by PGD. One can reject PGD even if one denies the right to live to embryos, because one objects to eliminating embryos with the genetic makeup that will lead to diseases and disabilities. A widespread argument in support of the idea that PGD is morally acceptable is that it relieves the able-bodied of the burden of caring for someone, and society of the need to provide extra resources. However, one needs to consider to what extent it is society that makes a physical impairment into a disability, and also to what extent society can change its focus from eliminating embryos with genetic diseases to treating them.